The world often misunderstands silence. They think quiet means retreat. Sometimes it means calculation. When Donald Trump says the killing must stop, when he pauses, when assets quietly move, but missiles do not fly, that is not weakness, that is restraint. In Iran, protesters filled the streets. The regime responded with violence, brutal force, enough to hold the system together, but not enough to make it stable. In Washington, advisors warned him an attack would not guarantee collapse. More firepower would be needed, more risk, more consequences. So the strike never came, not because the threat was empty, but because the cost was real. History is filled with moments like this, where action feels inevitable, but restraint quietly reshapes the outcome. If you want to understand how power really works today, stay with me, because what looks like hesitation is often strategy. And to see where this logic leads next, we need to define the problem more clearly. That starts now. This is not a story about a single decision. It is about a pattern. A president who threatens force, then pauses, not once, but repeatedly. In Iran, the question was simple on the surface. Should the United States strike a regime killing its own people? But beneath that question sat another. Would force actually change the system, or merely harden it? The assessments were sobering. The protests did not fracture the security apparatus. The regime held an airstrike could punish, but it could not guarantee collapse. At the same time, threats continued, assets moved, language stayed sharp, because credibility matters, especially for a leader who has cultivated unpredictability as leverage. This is the tension at the heart of modern power. Act too fast and you own the consequences. Act too little and threats lose meaning. The same logic appears elsewhere. Different geography, different allies, same question of leverage. To understand why restraint keeps reappearing, we have to step back. We need to look at how this cycle began and why history keeps repeating it. To understand this moment, we have to rewind. American power was built on a belief that overwhelming force could shape outcomes, that pressure applied hard enough would break regimes, but history complicated that belief. In 2009, Iranian protesters filled the streets. The world watched. The regime survived. The lesson lingered. In 2013, Syria crossed a red line. The strike never came. Restraint became precedent. Credibility became fragile. These moments created a cycle. Threats without follow-through. Action followed by unintended wars. Force that removed leaders but not systems. By the time Trump entered office, the script was already broken. He inherited wars no one could finish. Regimes that absorbed punishment and adapted, so his strategy shifted. Pressure without invasion, threats without occupation, force as leverage, not as default. In Iran, the calculus was brutal. A strike might rally the population around the flag. Violence could prolong the regime, not weaken it. Power in this era became indirect, measured, calculated, and once you see that pattern, the next escalation feels inevitable. Because restraint always carries a breaking point. Then came the first real test. The protests in Iran escalated. The regime responded with unprecedented violence. People were killed in numbers not seen in decades. The red line, at least rhetorically, was crossed. From Washington, the warning was blunt. If the killing continued, the United States would get involved, not diplomatically, militarily. For a moment, the world leaned forward. Assets moved into the region. Plans were reviewed. The option of force was real, but intelligence told a different story. The security apparatus did not fracture. The regime absorbed the shock. It held, and attack advisors warned, would not guarantee collapse. It would require more firepower, more troops, a deeper commitment than anyone was prepared to make. So the moment passed, not because the threat failed, but because the system proved resilient. This is the first crisis modern power runs into, when brutality exposes weakness, but intervention risks strengthening the very regime you want to break. If you're trying to understand why threats are made but not always used, this is the hinge point. Everything after builds from here. And what happens next is less visible, but far more important. What happens next is the part most people never see, because power today rarely moves in straight lines. It works in layers. The Iranian regime does not survive on ideology alone. It survives through control, information, fear, and force applied selectively. That is why overt military action is so dangerous. Bombs do not dismantle surveillance. Airstrikes do not restore trust. They give the regime an external enemy. Instead, the real battlefield stays hidden. Cyber operations, information flows, keeping the internet alive, helping voices escape the blackout. This is how regimes are hollowed out, quietly, gradually, without triggering national unity against a foreign attacker. History offers no evidence that airstrikes deliver democracy. Even occupations with hundreds of thousands of troops struggle to impose transitions. Systems adapt faster than armies, so the strategy becomes paradoxical. Threaten loudly, act quietly, weaken capacity without creating martyrs. This is restraint as mechanism, not hesitation, not fear, but restraint carries a cost because it depends on time, and time always tests credibility. That pressure builds, and eventually it looks for another outlet. Then the pressure surfaces somewhere else, not in the Middle East, but in the Arctic. Greenland entered the conversation. Quiet at first, then loudly. Suddenly, allies were confused. Denmark was alarmed. NATO felt exposed, because this was not just about land. It was about leverage, rare earths, strategic positioning. Russia, China, threats followed, tariffs, military language, the suggestion that force was an option. To some it looked reckless, to others it looked deliberate. The logic was familiar: create tension, trigger panic, increase bargaining power. But this crisis cut differently, because this time the pressure landed on allies, not adversaries. Europe heard something dangerous. That might makes right. That security guarantees could be conditional. That alliances were tools, not commitments. Polls told another story. Public support was thin. Americans were unconvinced. Less than 10% supported military action. Now the risk shifted. Not of war, but of erosion. Because once allies stop trusting restraint, they start planning for its absence. And that kind of fracture spreads fast. This is where it reaches you, because strategy is abstract, but consequences are personal. When great powers posture, it is ordinary people who live with the aftershocks. If you are Iranian, restraint means something complicated. It means fewer bombs, but also more waiting, more uncertainty, more nights wondering if help is coming at all. If you are American, restraint feels distant, until alliances weaken, until threats lose meaning, until the cost shows up later, larger, harder to contain. This is the quiet burden of modern power. You are asked to trust that pressure works, that time is doing something useful, that silence is not abandonment. But credibility is not theoretical. It shapes behavior. Regimes test it, allies measure it, adversaries push against it, and when threats are made in your name, their success or failure becomes part of your future, your security, your economy, your world. If this analysis helps you see that connection more clearly, pause for a moment, share it, because understanding power is the first step to holding it accountable. And next, we have to zoom out, because none of this stays contained. What happens in one place never stays there. Iran is not isolated. Neither is Greenland. They are nodes in a system. When restraint becomes policy, every actor recalculates. In the Middle East, rivals watch closely. They ask whether threats still carry weight, whether red lines are real or rhetorical. In Europe, allies draw different conclusions. If pressure can be turned inward, if tariffs replace trust, then security becomes transactional. That logic travels fast. Russia watches Ukraine, China watches Taiwan, not for similarities, but for signals. Signals about credibility, about consequences, about whether power enforces rules or merely negotiates them. This is the danger of strategic ambiguity. It buys flexibility, but it also invites testing. Every pause becomes data. Every restraint becomes precedent. Every threat not used reshapes expectations. Global order does not collapse overnight. It erodes, quietly, through accumulated doubt. And once enough actors stop believing in the system, they stop following its rules. That is why the next phase matters most, because the future is not one outcome. It is a set of paths, and we are already standing at the fork. From here, three futures begin to form. The first is stability through pressure. Threats remain credible. Quiet actions weaken regimes over time. Allies adjust, but stay aligned. Restraint proves effective because it is backed by patience and consistency. Power works without spectacle. The second is managed drift. Threats continue. Follow-through remains selective. No single crisis explodes, but credibility thins. Allies hedge. Adversaries probe more often. The system holds, but only barely. The third is fracture. Threats stop working. Restraint looks like fear. Pressure turns inward on allies. Force becomes normalized again. Not because leaders want war, but because deterrence collapses without belief. None of these paths is chosen deliberately. They emerge from accumulated decisions, from moments like Iran, from gestures like Greenland. Power is not what you say once, it is what others expect you to do next. And expectation, once lost, is almost impossible to recover, which is why the final question is not about Trump, or Iran, or Greenland. It is about what kind of order survives when restraint becomes the norm, and that is where this story ends and where the next one begins. Power rarely ends with a bang. It ends with a realization that threats only work when they are believed, that restraint only works when it is understood, and that silence without clarity invites miscalculation. Trump's strategy exposed something deeper, not the limits of force, but the fragility of order built on credibility. In Iran, violence bought time, not legitimacy. In Greenland, leverage created motion, but also mistrust. These are not contradictions, they are warnings. Because a world where pressure replaces consensus slowly abandons rules for transactions. And once that shift completes, there is no easy return. The hardest truth is this: power cannot outsource its consequences. Every pause shapes expectations. Every threat rewrites norms. If you want to understand the next crisis before it arrives, you have to watch the quiet moments, the pauses, the restraint. If this analysis challenged how you see global power, subscribe, stay with me, because the next story will not announce itself loudly. It never does.